Does the department have a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion here at the University of Kentucky?
I'm just a staff worker here. I'm just a staff worker.
I know there's like a push to like remove DEI, but as far as me wanting to go into counseling, I feel like that's an important part.
They're still hitting the buzzwords. Still in our program are diversity and diverse groups of students.
It's there. You have to teach these things. You have to teach these things. You have to teach these things.
I have no idea. I don't remember any of it.
We received a report that your department was still doing DEI work in defiance of state law, and that you merely just were changing the wording. Is that true?
I can't comment.
Welcome to my party, we're just getting started. A life is a dream or a nightmare scarring. Hell is so bizarre, empty out the reservoir. Yeah. I'm taking 6 shots, yeah, straight to the face. And I wanna get lost, I'm sick of this place. Don't know how to stop when I'm feeling this way. So I'm taking 6 shots till I'm feeling okay. I think I'm going crazy.
What you just saw was several clips from Accuracy in Media, who went undercover to expose the DEI situation at the University of Kentucky, followed by several DEI images from colleges and universities across the U.S. I'll put those video links along with other supporting material from today's video in this description. And I'll also get into this a bit more later, but starting in early 2025, institutions from colleges and universities to medical centers within them that receive federal funding are required to reduce or eliminate non-performance-based initiatives tied to diversity. But as we saw from Accuracy Media, that doesn't stop academic institutions from simply changing their terminology or outright ignoring these new federal orders altogether. Well, the opening video clips and images show what's going on in administrative offices and outreach efforts at colleges and universities. Today, I'm going to show what this looks like in academic medical centers by breaking down a research paper that was recently published in the Journal of American Medical Association's publication network, which outright calls for intentional recruiting of women into academic medical center leadership positions. Many of you may not be surprised at what they reported, but as I like to do, this will give you the evidence you need when people try to tell you that men are controlling everything in education and other major industries. So, put on your thinking caps, grab your coffee or Red Bull, because I'm going to dive into more feminist research to expose what's getting published in one of the most prestigious research networks on the planet, and how it's defying federal orders without any backlash or consequence.
It's time to all choose your timeline on the roller coaster of life.
Here's a look at the article that I'll be reviewing, but first, let's start by understanding the journal behind it. It was published by JAMA Network Open, an open-sourced research publisher. More broadly, JAMA is the Journal of the American Medical Association. It's a very prestigious, peer-reviewed medical journal covering biomedical research. It's the most widely circulated medical journal globally and includes the JAMA Network, which publishes 13 different journals around medical research, reviews, and commentaries. Now, academic journals are rated and ranked based on their impact factor. Impact factor is a metric that reflects how often its articles are cited by other authors. It's calculated by taking the number of citations in a given year to articles published in the previous 2 years, and then dividing that by the total number of citable journal articles published during that same 2-year window. You don't need to know how to do this, but while the flagship JAMA journal has an impact factor of about 60 and is in about the top 0.25% of journals, this journal's impact factor is about 10. That means on average, each recent article in the journal was cited about 10 times, which is upper tier and around the top 2 to 5% of journals published. So it's up there. And with that understanding, let's look at the details of this paper today. This is a research review paper in which the authors wanted to investigate and report on whether there is gender equality in leadership roles in U.S. academic medical centers. The review included publications between 2019 and 2022 using keywords related to things like gender, leadership, academia, and medicine. Have a look at their Prisma flow diagram here, and you can see how they filter down their results to 94 studies that met their review criteria, such as requiring a U.S. academic medical setting, a focus on institutional leadership roles, such as deans, department chairs, division chiefs, or program directors, along with the reporting of quantitative gender data in the studies that they reviewed. I'll see if I can get their supplemental material and put up their actual search terms here as well. But here's a couple of things that stood out to me up front. First of all, we can see that they have 10 different authors here, all of them women. I double-checked, I verified. 10 women published this article. We can see that this first one here, Morgan Levy, I think is the name, has an MD and a Master's of Public Health. The second, third, and I think fourth authors are all women that have undergraduate degrees. We see a Bachelor of Science here, a Bachelor of Arts, and a Bachelor of Science. We don't know what fields those are in. So this tells me that likely those students are, maybe they're in grad school, or maybe in some capacity they are doing research work for the lead author, and then all of the other ones here. Quite honestly, maybe one or two of them are relevant, but they are there for other things like their expertise, knowledge, and things like that. Honestly, let me tell you something. It does not require 10 people to do a study like this, a research review paper. This may be common in medical research. I don't know. I'm not that familiar with it. But I did one of these and published it as a graduate student. It was part of my dissertation. I did it with just myself and 2 undergraduate research students. It takes a while to do them. There's nothing difficult about them. It just takes a while to do it. We did it in about a year and a half, again, just part-time and as part of our studies and part of our lab work. And one other thing that stood out to me here is that in their initial search terms, which I will put them up for you to take a look at, but in their initial search, before they started filtering anything out, they come up with over 8,000 journals, articles published in just the years between 2019 and 2022. That's a lot of articles. They didn't review all of these. Have a look again at this little Prisma flow diagram, and you can see that they ultimately came down to 94 articles that they reviewed. So I'm not going to do this with the entire article, but I do want to have a look at some of their statements in their introduction. Right, so I'm not going to do this with the entire paper, but I want to make an understanding of how they're framing their argument that medical centers need more female executives and leaders. And one of the first statements that they make is that as of 2023, that's a couple of years ago and about the time that they were publishing this, no, I think this was published in 25, but they say that women represented the majority, 55% of U.S. medical students, right? So that's more than 50%. And then they continue that only 45% of all faculty are women, and only 25% of department chairs were women. And they have a problem with that. And my argument here is that students simply have not aged into those leadership positions yet. They're still early. And by the time they get into their careers, women will be making up more than 50% of all of those different positions. Again, so women just have not simply aged into the positions yet. And shortly after that, they say that women represent only 41.2% of associate professors and only 28.3% of full professors. But what they don't give is context. For example, maybe women don't want those full-time professor positions. Maybe many of them want to work as adjuncts or part-time professors. So it may just be a job selection and their preference on men and women and the amount of hours that they're willing to work. And down here they state the inequitable environment of academia threatens the success of women. And to that I have to say that this is an external locus of control. They're framing themselves as victims here, saying we are being threatened by something, basically is what they're saying. And shortly after that, they say that these trends might persist and even worsen over time. And to that my response is, I'd say that's very unlikely it's going to get worse over time, because they just stated that as of right now, 55% of all students are women. So the fact that they say it's going to or it might worsen over time, I think is preposterous. Another statement that they make is that additionally, female authors are significantly more likely to include female participants in their research, and clinical trials led by women are significantly more likely to recruit women as participants. And to that, my response is that there are absolutely zero hospitals dedicated to men's health in the United States. I did a video, a very lengthy breakdown on this about 6 months ago. So if they're worried about the number of research studies and participants of women in medical studies, that is absolutely ridiculous, because as I mentioned in that full video, see if I can put an overlay here if you want to go find it, there is absolutely nothing in the health industry going on for men. At this point, we can see that women just want everything. They want most of everything. You know, I didn't even put this in any of my comments that I wanted to go through as I go through this discussion. But why don't they say, hey, you know what? Why don't you give us 50% administrative leadership positions in these academic medical centers, and we'll give men half of the positions in teaching, right? But they're not willing to do that. They want to dominate every field without any consideration of what's actually going on in other fields outside of medical, the medical stuff here. They also make the comment that raw numbers alone, here they're talking about the raw numbers of women in these leadership positions in academic medical centers. They say the raw numbers alone do not accurately depict the underlying issue. And to that, my response is, it's raw data. This is where they're trying to give themselves context where they can make an argument. Basically what they're saying is, yeah, the raw numbers say one thing, but let me tell you why that doesn't matter, and we think that there's a problem. So those are just several statements within the introduction of their paper. As I mentioned, I'm not going to go through this entire thing. You can download a copy directly from the link that I'll put in the description. Let's move on just a little bit, because here's the part that actually got me to do this breakdown of this article in the first place, and it's incredibly sloppy for a top 2 to 5% journal. We can see in the results section what they noticed, or what they reported from the 95 articles that made it into their final review. They state here that providing mentorship was included in 20 of the articles that they reviewed. That's providing mentorship to women to help them get into those leadership positions. And they say that engaging in intentional recruitment of women was identified in 33 of their articles. But if we look down here, what we see is that they have these inverted, the mentorship and the intentionally recruiting of women. These bars in this histogram are reversed. And we'll see the same thing down here in the let me scroll down here into the discussion. Again here, provide mentorship at 36.2% with the intentional recruitment of women at 21%, which is, again, flipped. It's backwards from what we see in the histogram, I believe, and from the results. Honestly, it took me, in the results section. Honestly, it took me about an hour to figure out what was going on in here. I kept going back and forth. What am I missing? Turns out it's just sloppy work. So the results section states that they identified 33 articles, that's 35% of their sample, that recommended an increased intentional recruitment of women. And the citation list at the end supports that number as well. So I'm going with the number of 31 articles that they found that call for the intentional increased recruitment of women to put into academic medical center leadership. Again, very sloppy work here for a journal of this caliber. And think of the irony here. 10 very well-educated women publishing a review paper about needing to recruit more women into medical center leadership. And they can't even get their numbers straight in a paper that doesn't even require participants, data collection, or data analyses. But as far as their findings, they apparently found 33 out of 94 articles in their final sample that called for intentional recruiting of more women into academic medical center leadership positions. And what's in some of those 33 articles that suggested more recruitment of women? Let's have a look. So here's one of those 33 articles in which these authors state, "We are now sounding the alarm as our country inches closer to a," and they quote, "minority nation of persons who need a more representative physician workforce." Now, if I'm going to the hospital and I'm looking for a physician, I don't care what their specialty is, I don't care about representation. I want somebody who's going to have a safe working environment and get me the health care that I need. And here's a conclusion from another one of those 33 articles in which they say that racial and gender disparities remain prevalent at higher academic ranks and positions of leadership, especially among Black and Hispanic academic surgeons. Again, what the actual fuck? I don't care who my surgeon is as long as they are the most qualified person to do it and they're going to get me healthy again. Let's take a look at just one more. The authors of this paper that was in their review concluded that women are underrepresented in cardiology procedural specialties in the use of novel technology and key leadership roles. Again, it's the same thing. I was flabbergasted when I actually read this one. Women are underrepresented they're speaking here about novel technology. So new technology, something that people in generally are not familiar with. It might be experimental or, again, new technology. And you are more worried about having women in there and them being currently underrepresented than actually having the most qualified person do the work, especially with the use of novel technology. It just blows my mind. Now keep in mind, those articles in the review were published between 2019 and 2022. In early 2025, the federal government started to crack down on DEI initiatives, and there have been, in some instances, sweeping changes being made. I won't give any details specifically, but the university that I work for has been very diligent in making changes in their reporting and a lot of their ways that they approach different things because of a lot of these things. So those were published before the federal government started to crack down on these things with executive orders and actually enforcing some Title VII, I think it is, laws. Here's some of what's been happening in the last year or so. Some institutions have, in fact, started to eliminate or restructure many of their DEI initiatives. Some of them, for example, have renamed their services or reduced publicly reported demographic data. I know that's certainly something that I've experienced in my position, my full-time job. Others have exercised caution about what to track, what to say, or how to document a lot of their data and their outcomes. But the biggest shift has been tied to the risk of losing federal funding. For example, universities are required now, maybe they always have been, to review their hiring practices, the language that they put into their grant applications, and any program that's tied to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And some of the consequences include terminating contracts, that is the federal government terminating contracts if DEI policies are not in compliance. Now, we would think that this creates a strong incentive to avoid anything that could be interpreted as preferential or identity-based. But as we can see, they just continue by using different words or having their discussions behind closed doors rather than out in the open. In a nutshell, the recent executive orders are intended to change institutional incentives and how they operate when it comes to fairness for everybody. Universities should be operating under a framework wherein identity-based initiatives carry legal and financial risk. But we all know that that's not really what's going on, or that it's not happening as it should. Now back to the article and the point of this discussion. These authors move quickly from describing gender representation to calling for intentional recruiting of women. But they never discuss the qualifications. In fact, let me bring this up because I think I almost forgot. Let me bring up their conclusions here. These are the ultimate conclusions that these authors come to. They say that this systematic scoping review found that ultimately current efforts to promote gender equality in institutional leadership at academic medical centers have been inadequate. That is one of two sentences in their final conclusion. But that's not what they did in this study at all. They do not systematically evaluate current efforts in any type of rigorous way, such as, for example, measuring outcomes of specific programs or comparing institutions with or without incentives or showing any before and after effects of policies. That's not what they did. So how they can come to this conclusion is entirely speculative. So where does that conclusion come from? The statement about current efforts have been inadequate is more of an inference based on the conclusion that they want to come to. It's not a direct testing of any findings or anything that they reported on. It's essentially saying that women are still underrepresented, And therefore, whatever has been done so far hasn't solved it. That's all they're saying. And the second statement in their conclusion is they say increase female representation in leadership positions with a clearly defined trajectory, especially in fields comprising of more than 50% women, should take priority. Basically, all they're saying here is that in fields where women make up 50% or more of the people entering or working in that field, then leadership positions should reflect that same proportion. And if it doesn't, then institutions should actively work to increase women in leadership. They should hire more women in leadership. Again, it's all about the numbers for them. They don't say anything about the quality of care, qualifications, anything like that. Their entire argument rests on gender representation more than knowledge or experience, which leaves a gap between what's measured and what is recommended. Now listen, call me crazy, but I think that leadership should be demonstrated by expertise, performance, and institutional fit. Hell, even if somebody wants to work in a certain job at all. Not everybody wants to work in a leadership position. Maybe women most of all, especially if they're family women. And aligning gender ratios with workforce composition assumes, without evidence, that experience and knowledge are equally distributed and developed across leadership positions. But this paper doesn't even do that. It does not examine or even discuss whether differences in training pathways, career timing, specialization, or, as I mentioned, even people's own career preferences affect who is actually prepared and willing to lead a medical center. Shouldn't the goal be to run medical centers as safely, costly, and efficiently as possible? Shouldn't that be the focus of research rather than how many men and women are in certain positions? If the goal is nothing more than proportional leadership, then the underlying assumption is that disparity is a problem, and that's focusing on the wrong topic. My contention is that a more honest analysis would separate questions of access and opportunity from questions of qualifications. But let me know your thoughts. How does this line up with your experience, what you've seen in the medical industry, or what conversations you've heard in real life? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see y'all soon.